Well, welcome to the Monday, October 24th, 2011 meeting of the Brattleboro Planning Commission. Just to do a quick agenda review, besides the usual routine stuff, tonight we're going to have a discussion of the energy chapter and also a discussion sort of early on the I should say the early on version of the housing chapter, specifically about current conditions. So the first order of business would be to approve the minutes of our last meeting, which was October 12th. Is there a motion? I know everybody's read these, gone over them with a fine-tooth comb. So I'm just looking for a motion to approve.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? I just have one question. I think that Julia did a great job of capturing the salient points. But it says that I said that the chapter does not address motor scooters.
Yeah.
And
Specifically, we meant something other than scooters.
yeah, I think motorized
I think
chairs
mobility
is what
devices.
I would say. Yeah, mobility
Yeah.
devices, whatever
Right.
it's called. I don't want people to think that I was asking about motor scooters because I wasn't, but whatever they're called, I think that's what motorized chairs, is it, or?
Yeah, it's,
Mobility.
there's an acronym for it.
Yeah, it's mobility. Is it mobility
It's a
devices?
personal mobility device. I
Personal
think.
mobility devices.
There you
something
go.
like that, so.
I think that's how ADA did.
Okay.
That's much
So
better.
is that PMDs or?
Something like that.
Yeah, because scooters
Sure.
creates a whole different
Yeah.
connotation,
I
totally.
think there's a brand name that they refer to as scooters.
Power chairs.
Yeah. So that's my only comment about it. Any other discussion about the minutes?
Is that a typo there?
SOV dependence,
Yeah, what's SOV?
single occupancy vehicle.
Oh, thank you.
Not to be confused with SOB.
We're
Or
live.
SUV.
SUVs, yeah.
We're live, young man. Anything else? All those in favor of accepting the minutes,
With amendments?
please say aye. With that one
Aye,
amendment.
with changes?
That one change, yeah. Any opposed? Motion carries. So the next item is announcements. The first item there is the joint DRB Planning Commission meeting, and we had proposed that it be November 7th. And it turns out that the DRB has a kind of a full slate that night, maybe really full slate that night. So we talked about postponing that to December 5th.
Do you mean they have
That's
a
what
full
we
slate?
talked about, but I don't know. Did you speak to?
I haven't had
DRB?
I haven't had a
You
chance to
did.
I
catch
talked
up
to
with
Tim,
you.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and Tim thought that would be good.
Okay, great.
So if we all can do that,
December 5th
yeah,
at 7 right here.
December 5th at 7 right here, yeah. Yep.
That's a Monday?
Yep.
At
That's
7,
the-
not 6.
Oh, yeah, it is up
Yeah,
there.
that's it. Yeah, they meet later.
And they stay later. Yeah.
Okay.
I think they pack a lunch too, so.
Okay.
So the
Yes.
new date would be the 5th of
true.
December at 7 o'clock.
And it may run into the 6th, but who's counting?
Yeah, right. At the select board meeting room. And Tim also said that it would be handy because it would give them a little more time to discuss the things that they want to prepare for that meeting, so. Sue or Rod, would you like to speak about the AARP
Yeah, I just,
livable communities?
sure, I just wanted to remind the commission that the AARP Livable Communities Workshop is going to be next Tuesday at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. A lot of people in the room are already signed up, but if more commissioners or public want to attend, it's still open. And that's going to bring Dan Burden to the community, and he'll work with a group of stakeholders on the day, during the daytime, morning and daytime, to look at Canal Street. And then he'll also be doing an evening presentation at 6:30 at Marlboro Graduate Center. So Timberly, Carolina, and Liz have signed up, and some members of the audience as well.
Has
Did you
this
say-
been sent out to people like TPAC members and other people who've been involved with us over the,
It's been sent out to kind of a more a targeted list, so people who've been involved with Canal Street. Julia and I talked about TPAG on Friday, but it was a short day for me. We'll follow up with her.
and also the people who were at the previous meeting that was at Canal Street in
They
the
did receive
hospital?
that. Yeah.
Because there was a
that
lot
list
of good
people.
energy at that
Yep.
meeting and a lot of stakeholders there
Yeah.
from the neighborhoods and the businesses, and so,
That list of people did
Great.
get the invitation.
thanks.
So did you say my name in that list?
I did not say your name. Would you like to come?
Thanks.
Yes, I would.
You
I
would.
know you didn't say mine, but I think I recall.
You may have
Yeah.
responded.
Okay, did enough. Yeah.
I'm going to be going at night
Okay.
to the, and that's at 6:30
6:30,
at the
Yeah.
Grad Center?
and we need the RSVPs more for the daytime. Evening, everybody is.
Yeah, I'll miss the night. I have a previous commitment, but I'll be there all day.
Okay. And the next day is the meeting up north. Is that, we know who's going to that from the commission? Is it not?
Yes,
Am I-
it is the next day. Yes.
Yes.
We have Liz and Carolina.
Yep.
So far, I think so, but I'm waiting to find out on a work thing, so. But I've tentatively planned to.
We're really going to confirm tomorrow. Is the
Okay, I
drop
can
dead
find out
date.
tomorrow.
Okay. So,
That's the second.
right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody have any other announcements? Okay. And the next item is other business. We don't get a lot of other business, but anybody got any other business? Okay. The next thing is public comment. Now, this is public comment that's not related to the energy chapter and the housing chapter. So if there's anything that isn't related to that, that you folks from the public would like to comment on or have some burning desire to stand in front of this microphone, please do. Otherwise, we'll be right with you on the energy chapters and so forth. Okay. So next item is discussion of the energy chapter, which we all got in our packets. Does everybody have a copy of it? Everybody? Yeah. Chris, do you have a copy?
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure. You don't?
Oh,
Extra
yeah.
over there.
Okay.
I don't spoil them.
So, I think we'll do as we have done at Rod, do you want to give us an overview of this chapter, or we didn't really talk about how we were going to talk about this?
Energy? Yeah, I'm happy to give you an overview. First
Like
of all,
maybe even things like how many meetings and drafts and sort of like that, just roughly, you know.
Oh. I probably lost count of the number of meetings, but, and it's been a while. There's been a delay. So, we set it aside. You okay, Liz? Maybe not. For reasons to do with other more pressing events. But I guess in the early summer and spring, there was a small working group that was formed, or maybe even further back than that, made up of members of the Energy Committee and the Planning Commission to look at various aspects of the energy chapter together. And the primary issue to be resolved there was the identification of baselines and establishing goals, and that was also around the issue of access to ICLEI data and what kind of data we could use to identify progress on goals. So that work was completed, and then I started to make some of the inclusions in the draft of the energy chapter that came out of those meetings, and then I guess effectively a smaller group, mostly consisting of me, Sue, and Paul, have been working primarily in the office, to some extent also with Jim Bazzino, dealing with some issues around goals and policies and action steps in particular, but the energy chapter in general. So, in general, one of the challenges that we have and will most likely continue to have is being able to access data that's relevant to Brattleboro as a jurisdiction for issues around energy use and the side effects of that, including the emission of CO2. Some other subtle changes or commitments that we made in that process was to actually talk explicitly about carbon emissions as being a legitimate goal for the energy chapter, and so they're now explicitly specified, and to identify ways in which the town of Brattleboro as an organization and the school district as an organization can meet explicit goals for their own operations and buildings as a way of exhibiting best practice so that it might be pursued by private entities and the public more generally. So I think that is a summary of the...
Rod, can I just ask you, so when you just said that about the municipal facilities and then the school facilities, right? Those as two clusters or two groups, or not specific buildings necessarily, right?
I think it's better to think of them as management entities. So the goals and action steps that are contained in the chapter now explicitly identify buildings under the control of the municipality as well, and the school district, and also their operations. So that reaches out into questions of fleet management and practices around the use of vehicles and other issues, okay, which, you know, we don't specify, but I guess here I'm thinking of as broadly as finding innovative ways to encourage carpooling amongst staff, reducing single occupant vehicle commutes for those workplaces, encouraging exercise and activity on the part of staff and households associated with those, you know, with both the town and the school district and so forth. So a variety of ways of achieving a reduction in emissions, not just focusing on the buildings. The school district and the municipality were both engaged in the Honeywell project, as far as I understand. And so it's a follow-on from earlier work that Paul in particular has undertaken with the town
Okay.
and the school district.
Okay.
And then the last part of it is that, speaking of the structure, which obviously still needs to be filled out a little more, there's a more nuanced discussion of issues in the introduction, which I think is an effort to link the current best practice in planning, land use planning and community planning with the issues around energy, and make the links there between the layout and design of communities and the assumptions around energy usage that they contain. And then in the subsequent sections of the chapter, trying to look at it in sequence so that the current conditions are described in terms of energy use and then energy sources, and then moving on from there to look at in more detail energy use in Brattleboro schools and municipal facilities where we actually have good quality data stretching back now 20 years. And then to look at, in turn, energy conservation, because it's the most affordable and easily achieved reduction in emissions and improvement in energy performance. And then efficiency, which is a little more complex and but that is sort of the next step up. So the parallel here, or the sort of the analogy here would be energy conservation largely is associated with doing the same amount of activity but with less energy. So turning off lights, just being more conscious of the way we use energy, but not really proposing to change dramatically what we do. Energy efficiency measures are designed to actually replace equipment and structures with more high performance versions, so that with the same amount of energy, the same amount of activity involves less energy consumed. And then lastly, moving on to renewable energy in that section. So a discussion of substitutes for conventional sources of energy. And then the last section, the last two sections, I guess, the first one is energy and transportation, which accounts for the single biggest chunk of energy consumed in the community, consistent with national energy usage patterns. And if you look at the chart on page 6, you'll see that transportation is responsible for about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's 2008 numbers, and I don't think they're terribly different in 2010. And so if we're to make any meaningful commitment to a reduction in greenhouse emissions, it's going to need to happen in the transportation sector. So complete streets is a sort of a connection there. And then the last section would be energy and land use. And here we're thinking of the links between compact development and energy consumption.
Okay.
So does that answer you? Does anybody have any questions about that?
Well, maybe we could start from one end and see if people have questions in general about the chapter, or questions or comments, and just sort of do a once through to start with. You want to start on your end, Joe?
The complete streets, that integrates all modes of transportation, that program, right, into this. So this greenhouse gas emissions by sector transportation, how does that, what does transportation encompass? Everything, every mode of, I mean, rail and everything?
Yes.
Train?
Some trains are diesel generated, and some electricity is also generated by coal. So they're both fossil fuel sources for some percentage of train travel. That's I guess I'm answering the second part of your question first, and then with reference to complete streets or how it connects, I think it's an indirect connection, and so I think the turn to complete streets identifies other road users that apart from car drivers, and the single biggest contribution to transportation is private motor vehicles. So the percentage of that half of the pie chart that's consumed by trucking or those sorts of
Public transportation.
yeah, it's a fraction of the transportation. Most of the transportation emissions are generated by private car use.
The majority of that 50% chunk you're saying?
Yeah, well over
Is-
40% is derived from private car use.
Huh. So
Now-
in essence, you're saying well over 80% of the 50 is just private automobile use?
Yep.
Oh, I see.
So there's a couple of key things that you can take away from that. One is that the Complete Streets program would be an indirect connection to energy. So by encouraging non-car based modes of transportation, that's the strongest way the local community could make a contribution to changing the balance between private car use and alternate forms of transportation. So it could be a combination of you using a bicycle and a bus to get to and from work or to and from school, or
Carpooling
yeah, exactly. So, but the emphasis on pedestrian activity and bicycles, and in particular for Complete Streets, is a way of making the transition from private car use to other non-fossil fuel forms of transportation easier. So, we're assuming that people are still perhaps reluctant to walk or ride a bike because they think it's not as safe as driving a car.
All right. Thank you.
Anything else, Joe? Carolina?
I don't know, there's just, I don't know the right words. I just feel like there's some things, some more specific things that could be here that aren't here, and I don't even know how to verbalize them. I mean, I think all of this is good, but some part of it, like when I look at the sheet you just handed us from Michael Bosworth, his comments.
Yep.
I guess I don't see more specifics about things we want to explore or encourage, unless it shows up more in the body of it, but I don't see that so much in the actions
Oh,
and the policies.
okay.
And maybe you could help me there.
Yeah.
Or
well,
maybe some of the people on the Energy Committee who are here could.
Well, let me whip down Michael's list, because I just got him not long before I got into the
I know,
meeting.
that's all.
So,
Did the people on the Energy Committee get that list too?
We don't have extra copies. I can go-
we could grab some extra.
if you give me.
Yeah,
it.
sure. Okay. So I'd say that we're back to our sort of basic problem of sort of who's on first base. So
Yeah.
to go through Michael's list, the first one is do not put controls on where solar arrays and farms can be sited. Alternatively, put some controls only on larger arrays and farms, particularly commercial ones. None of this is actually under the purview of the Planning Commission or the Development Review Board. It's Act 248. So that one's, kind of like,
Yeah, you don't have to go through them
Right.
one by one.
Well,
Unless maybe that's helpful.
I think it could be helpful. And
Okay.
then the second one is the same, effectively, but it refers to wind generation. And it's the comment is structured in the same way either. Do not put
Yeah.
any controls on wind generation facilities, or alternatively put
That's
some
negative.
on, but no control on rooftop wind systems. I would say at this point that the science on rooftop wind systems is conclusive in that they are practically useless. Okay, so what I'd say there is if people want to have a rooftop wind system, I wouldn't have too much to comment on it again, but it's also Act 248, and the power generated by rooftop wind systems is negligible.
I have one question about controls. Is that like the height of them, how they
Right.
reflect?
And
Yeah,
so
okay.
again, and the important thing to break out here is that in any one of these instances, if the entity that's, thank you, Sue, generating the energy from an alternative source is selling it back onto the grid, which is generally the way most entities want to do it, because then that pays back the capital outlay for the alternative energy generation, then it's covered by Act 248. If they're off the grid, so if it was a property somewhere in West Brattleboro or somewhere else and they were completely disconnected from the grid, actually the Planning Commission and the Development Review Board do have the ability to comment on that and review
Okay,
that
yeah.
in a standard set of ways. But I think at this point we're accepting that in large part people are going to want to tie to the grid because that's the way they're going to
Yeah.
want to pay for it. And in that instance, there's very little regulatory oversight that the local community does. And so the questions of siting and impact and so forth are all handled by the Public Service Board through Act 248.
Okay.
The same would be true of methane digesters, again, if they were to tie to the grid. I don't think we explicitly call out methane digesters as something that we want to promote, but Carbon Harvest has a methane digester
Yeah.
as a central component of their project, and it's something that we
Project
have.
Cow?
What's that?
Project Cow?
No.
That's different. But we actually financially supported that. So maybe we should just make more of that. Then the next one is distributed or
Yeah.
district energy woody biomass fueled heat plants and cogeneration plants should be encouraged. The larger they are, the more they should depend on boiler technology that burns more freely of particulate matter, and the more they should be sited in areas less susceptible to air inversions. That last part is actually the big challenge, because I'm
Yeah.
actually aware that along the Connecticut River there is the
time, yeah.
likelihood of air inversions, which means that you get a layer of pollution that settles fairly close to the ground, and so the local air quality suffers dramatically.
Isn't that also controversial in the amount of cutting down of trees?
Yeah.
There are
Sources of.
There are,
biomass.
there are, I guess, competing calculations as to how much woody biomass you'd end up having to use to fuel these, and so,
I wouldn't think that the planning commission would want to go out on a limb and say that they encourage or discourage. They would rather look at the merits of a case.
right. In
Yeah.
fact, one of the things that we haven't got to yet, but comes up in the land use and energy section, is that in all these instances, and all the ones that we've just mentioned, including solar arrays and wind turbines, we're conscious that there are potentially negative land use impacts experienced by abutters or the community more generally. So one of the things that the Jam Golf Course decision and other practice in planning encourages us to do is to make explicit statements saying to what extent the community is open to or receptive to these projects, but also flagging that appropriate review from an environmental impact assessment standpoint is something that the community is also concerned to make sure is protected. Part of the challenge there is that many of the alternative or renewable energy sources that I've just referred to, that environmental impact assessment being undertaken by the local community has been somewhat centralized at the Public Service Board level. We still have the ability to comment there, and that's something that I think we should explicitly mention in this chapter that we want to preserve. So I would say something like a balanced statement would be, we encourage it, but we're also aware of the potential for impact. And
Yeah.
So are we parties to an Act 248 hearing?
We
We
can-
are, right? We have commented before.
We have the ability to comment.
Yeah. Okay.
So the next one is encourage siting of charging stations for electric vehicles. I don't think that there's any real conflict with current zoning. There are charging stations for electric vehicles already in the parking garage. I would expect some kind of more obvious market response, including, potentially gas stations or parking lots in town, offering charging stations for electric vehicles for a fee once that becomes, a viable business opportunity. So I don't see our current local regulations as being a barrier there, but that would be something that would be fun to check and important to do. The next point is anticipate that there might be more distribution line needs in the future. In a scenario with decentralized renewable generation, there will be a need for new gas lines to carry methane or hydrogen lines from chemically bound energy storage facilities to gas generation plants. That's a question. Will there be a need for new electric lines? And then Michael refers us to a study undertaken in Germany. We've not actually undertaken that kind of planning work, and again, using the Velco upgrade as an example, wherever utility lines or similar are upgraded or added, it is a process that's conducted through the Public Service Board and Act 248. So again, the town has an ability to comment, and under those circumstances, I believe the entities building the infrastructure would have to seek a certificate of public good, and we would be parties to that if the lines went through the municipality, as would private landowners if it was new. There are obviously existing infrastructure and they have easements, and they could perhaps be more intensely utilized, and that's something that's worth exploring. His next point is consider exempting energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements from the base for real estate appraisals. I think that's interesting to explore. I'm not sure how much impact that would necessarily have. And then the next question and the last one was, why does the chapter differentiate between energy conservation and energy efficiency? And I think it's because I left energy efficiency out as a subhead. So that's a pretty simple question to answer.
So of the things that Michael sent to us, it looks like we would talk a little bit about renewables and siting, things like that, participating in Act 248 hearings
Right.
possibly,
Right.
and talk about it in land use.
Yep. The one thing, just before we go on, the one thing that we're aware of with solar panels, I guess explicitly now, is a sort of a two-way interaction. So we're aware that some people find solar panels, specific solar panels in their location objectionable because of the increased glare and the risks associated with that glare and the discomfort that that can generate. And then the reverse has also come to light, where people have complained that somebody has built a new structure perfectly in keeping with the zoning ordinance on their property, but it's shaded their solar panels as a consequence and reduced their performance. We don't have performance criteria for the location of new buildings with reference to whether it's going to shade or impact the potential location for solar panels, and we don't review solar panel locations in regard to the glare or any negative impact that's generated by them either. So it's just, those are comments that I'd want to try and capture for the zoning ordinance, but that's that's a pretty fine-grained detail problem.
But that would go into the land use regs, and then the
Yep.
potential, or not the potential, but the future rewrite of the
Zoning ordinance.
ordinance.
Right.
Yeah, okay. We have that, we'll have that down in there.
Yeah, we've got it captured for those purposes.
Okay, all right.
Is there any way that, I've heard of, and I don't know specifically, some towns that encourage in their, maybe, I don't know if it's in their permitting process, but in trying to encourage people to build, like, whether it would be commercial buildings or residential buildings, to build more energy efficient or passive solar, or to build in relationship to that. And I know our state doesn't have a lot of building codes per se, but is there some way to
There, Okay.
look at that in terms of how we support people in the town?
Well, we have a newly adopted, or well, it took effect October 1st, the Energy Building Code. So it is a,
there is a state requirement to meet energy efficiency for the building envelope, and that's relevant to both commercial and residential structures.
And that's new.
well,
I
it's
think it's
not
been
new that
around.
we have one, but it's
The set of standards are
The
new.
rewrite of it, and the set of standards is new,
There-
October 1st, so.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
they're actually doing energy code review in Rutland, and I should have said that in the announcements, sorry. I can email, you know what I'm talking about? It's in Rutland, there's one in Berlin, Vermont, and another one in Burlington. The one in Rutland is on the 14th. And it's just getting people up to speed on changes in the energy code
Right.
requirements.
Right. Right. So, in fact, that's a state requirement, and not all states do that, but Vermont does. And then beyond that, I think it's reasonable to say there's aspects of Chapter 117 that make it difficult to ensure passive solar gain, in particular for 1 and 2 family dwellings, because we don't do site plan review. And that would be the only way you could verify the orientation of the house and the placement of the windows. We don't even, and even if we did site plan review, we wouldn't be looking at elevation drawings to establish any kind of criteria associated with the building envelope in that sense. And we don't have anything currently in the zoning ordinance that would cover the construction or placement of commercial structures or larger scale structures. So I'm not sure how much ability we would have to do that either, but there's probably some more scope there than there is for 1 and 2 family dwellings.
I think that there's probably some scope for it in subdivision, though.
Right.
As to
So we could ask.
where the building
Right.
envelopes are.
Right.
I mean, as people come in and want to
Right.
build new,
Well, as they create a subdivision, which
So-
doesn't really happen very often.
yeah.
So one is the orange.
Brattleboro,
So there's a couple of weird interactions here. One is that, for reasons that still remain something of a mystery to me, people orient the front of their house to the street, regardless of whatever else is going on. So you may have a nicer view to the rear, or you might have your southern exposure might be to the side or whatever, but people will still ignore that obvious physical relationship in the positioning and the design of their home because it's oriented towards the street. And it's true to some extent in commercial structures also. So there's this tradition of facing the street. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that when people lay out a subdivision design, they're doing it in relationship to the topography and the kind of obstacles that they encounter on the ground, and with less thought being given to how the shape of the individual parcels is going to be arranged, and then whether the long side of the parcel is going to be allow for a southern elevation to take advantage of passive solar gain. So there's a couple of things that you can get at that through subdivision design.
Yeah.
And then the last one would be really getting property owners and developers to identify not the building envelope per se, but the area on the parcel that they intend the building to be located in. Sometimes you can, and we went through this with rural commercial to some extent, trying to figure out where on the lot you're going to place the building and how it's going to be oriented. And I think it would be an interesting discussion to have to see if people would be willing to
Yeah.
accept that level of control over the actual location of a new building. on a parcel.
But within that, we decided not to go there because
We did.
we had never done that here before.
Right.
And it was sort of a big undertaking for what we were trying to
Yes.
work on. So that may be something that could be included.
I think
in
it's
subdivision.
worth exploring through the zoning and
Yeah.
subdivision rewrite
Yeah.
requirements, yeah.
Okay.
Even just to include it as to explore, you know,
Sure.
even if you don't want to
Yep.
put it in there, I mean, whatever, I mean, I just
Yep.
really think it's important that we begin, and part of it is educating the public that doesn't know, rather than always doing buildings just what's the easiest, or what makes the most money, or always facing the street. There are other ways to
Right.
do it that still can appeal to people, but, and part of that is education.
Would
So
that-
let me just, excuse me just a second. We're wanting to probably talk about this for probably another 40 minutes, I would think. I mean, it's more time than what we were thinking, but, and we do have people that it would be great to hear from everybody that wants to speak. So I'm just thinking if we can go along
I'm
as
fine.
commissioners and, you know, ask questions sort of crisply and all that, and then we'll have time to talk again. Lord knows we'll have time to talk again, so.
I'm willing to pass the baton to the next at this point.
Okay. I just had a few quick things. In action, under Policy 1, Action 1.3, the action is to report annually on progress towards energy reduction goals for the community and so forth. Who would you think the report would be done to, and who would generate the report? So Paul, you'll be reporting to yourself? Is that?
I think we'll be.
You report every year at town meeting anyways, don't you?
Right.
Paul, why don't you stand up and speak in the microphone, please, and then we'll have this on, in the public eye.
I do make a very general report at town meeting, but nothing, I don't think,
Right.
I think this is referring to something a lot more specific and data-oriented.
Uh-huh.
And I'm assuming it would, you know, I could do a report that would go to the planning commission and the planning staff and the select board and whatever other entities would be interested in it.
Yeah, okay. So for the foreseeable future, it would be you who would be generating the report, or the Energy Committee and you, or
Yes,
something?
yes.
Okay, thank you. You know, a couple of these actions talk about training, and I just wanted to put in a word for CCV as well as the Career Center and Vermont Tech, and I don't know if that was not in there for a reason, or...
No.
Okay. It's a pet peeve of mine, that Greenfield Community College has all the solar training,
I know.
and we don't. So
Very interesting.
I just assume stick CCV in there too.
Well, I'm curious if I don't know the Massachusetts system, but it seems like CCV is liberal arts, where that's more technical training that seems to fall more under the technical college. So I don't, like I said, I don't know the difference between the systems.
Yeah, I don't know
That
either.
must be why.
Can still be a pet peeve though, right?
Kind of.
Even
So
if
you-
it's uneducated. No.
Right.
I just wondered if you would look and see whether that's appropriate or not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how
Seems
that
kind of
goes.
ironic for people to be driving to Greenfield to do energy training. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not.
There's no, well, the parking garage isn't in the facility list. I wondered if that was something that would be or should be or could be.
Which list are you referring to, Gary?
It's facility name, all
Page 4.
the energy use
Oh,
in the facilities.
yep.
Sure. Gotta stand up though, Paul, sorry.
It's not in there because the table covers buildings, the data from 2000 and 2010. The parking garage wasn't built in 2000, so that's why it's not included.
Okay, but there's good data for it otherwise?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We-
Thank you.
Do we, Paul, I can't remember when it was it 2005? 4?
2004, maybe, I'm not sure.
Was it for?
Do you think it's improved in its energy efficiency? Sorry, because I mean, if it has posted improvements, it might be nice to try and include it as a footnote or something.
Yeah, I could include it as a footnote because it has included, it has improved dramatically because of the LED lights that were installed
That's what I was
a
thinking.
couple of years ago.
Maybe we should try and get it in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's-
Under energy and transportation, I wondered if there are numbers for the town of Brattleboro fleet. I almost think we've talked about this before.
We have talked about that. I have talked to, DPW has storage tanks for diesel and gasoline, and the town fleet effectively uses that
Uh-huh.
site. And so there is a way in which you can sort of get at that statistics. There's a challenge right now as to whether it's technically possible that you could generate the number. It's just not a good time to ask.
Sure, yeah, but it might be something to
Yeah,
just
we can
look
get
at
that.
for the future.
Right.
That
One thing
informa-
that wouldn't reflect is things such as with earth moving equipment in particular, it's machine time. So to take it, for example, the recent storm, you would see a huge increase in diesel consumption for this year over the last 10 years.
Oh, sure.
And it would be entirely explainable in
Yeah.
terms of the number of hours that they've operated the machinery. So it's hard to kind of get at efficiency figures for those kinds of vehicles, but
I'm thinking more of transportation,
yeah.
getting from
And
one
then the only
place to
other
another. and-
thing is that since we moved the bus management from the town to Connecticut River Transit, they do not get diesel from the town anymore, so that there's a change there.
And
So,
my
I'm sorry,
last-
Paul, did that?
I just want to say that I do gather that data as part of the greenhouse gas inventory, so I have the gallons of diesel and
Right.
gas consumed annually
Yeah, okay.
from
great.
that tank at the Public Works garage.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Only last thing is, we've spoken about the roundabout and the possibility of more roundabouts. One thing that struck me about the roundabout from the information that we got from the state at one point was how much greenhouse gas emission reduction there was as opposed to the traffic light system. So, and it was very dramatic and sort of incredible.
So is that a complete streets kind of item?
Yeah, I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
All right.
Just that I think that it would be interesting to go back and look at that number. There was a guy in in V-Trans that was the roundabout sort of maven guy, and he came up with the given the traffic counts and everything, what the difference was between all those cars sitting at lights and people moving, and it was a pretty dramatic number. It looked like almost the best thing we could ever do to reduce greenhouse gases in town. So, one fell swoop, but I'm done. Kimberly.
One of the, this may fall under economic development, but I think there should be more prominence on the fact that measures, weatherization measures create jobs. And it also reduces for every resident that does this, they're reducing their cost of living. So it seems like a win-win, and they're saving energy, reducing their carbon footprint. I feel like that's something that, even in the housing, the transportation, all of this stuff, weatherization is probably one of the most beneficial, well-rounded types of measures that we can support as a community or as a state or however you want to position it. I know SEVCA works with Efficiency Vermont or does the training for it, but when we were talking about CCV and Greenfield College or GCC,
Community college.
I think there needs to be more, what do you want to call it? More focus, more emphasis on the fact that's a needed aspect of our economy. The transportation statistic, is that, I'm making an assumption, but is that based on the fact that people have to drive to work and they're driving outside the area to commute to Massachusetts or New
You
Hampshire,
mean
or from suburban areas to downtown, or what?
I don't think there's very much different with the greenhouse gas. So you're referring to the pie chart on page 6, where transportation accounts for 50%? Is that?
Single occupancy vehicles mainly.
We are a little bit different from the national average, and not in a good way in that regard to some extent, and most of it can be explained by reference to the rural nature of Vermont. And so I think I can't source this data, and I've talked to Paul about it, and I can't figure out where I got it from, but I think that the average commute distance for Vermonters is actually one of the highest in the country, but the time is not necessarily the longest, and that indicates rural road and interstate travel. And single person occupancy is pretty commonplace as part of that pattern. So, and in fact, there was something on the radio this morning that I tried to catch, but basically there's a review that's just been completed of Vermont, state-by-state review of various state governments' commitment to energy initiatives, and Vermont scores really well around Efficiency Vermont and other measures such as that, but does fairly poorly, scored only 4 out of 9 possible points, I think they said, in the area of transportation. And so there's a couple of other challenges as well. Because of the rural nature and the small population, it's very difficult to have a viable public transit system. And so, again, that pushes people back into their cars.
Is it goods and services that people are going other places to get, or is it people traveling to other places to work or to?
I think it's all of the above. I mean,
All of
I think it's just a very car-dependent landscape, much more so than suburban, large suburban areas, because there are no alternatives. From speaking from experience here, 16-year-olds here get their license and get a car and start taking on their share of driving the rest of the family around. And it's a real standard practice here, and it's somewhat different from other parts of the country. It's just a given. And so accessing entertainment, work, goods and services, it all requires, to some extent, use of motor vehicles. And it's a really motor vehicle dependent culture.
Yep.
Yeah, is that your take?
Yep, for sure.
Yep.
So I would say that just from my perspective and knowing and I'm sure this is only a small population of people, but to provide resources to the community so that they don't have to travel elsewhere. It's easy to work remotely, you know, computers, the internet, to be able to give people the resources, you know, however that the library is a great resource, obviously. You know, I feel like kind of missing the boat on, this isn't about energy either. So I'll stop that comment there. But I do feel like, I'll just, the other question, and this is energy and transportation, what's the rule about bikes and skateboards on sidewalks? No? Cops don't allow it?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I don't.
I mean, I don't have any personal objection to sharing the sidewalk with anything small, as long as it's not as big as a car, I'm fine. And I have actually encountered the odd car on a sidewalk in Brattleboro, so I'm a little leery, but
Yeah.
pretty much, I don't know what it is. I haven't checked, and I don't complain.
Not
Well-
allowed.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure skateboards aren't allowed. I'm assuming
Bikes
bikes
aren't,
aren't either.
Yeah. I would say that skateboarding should be encouraged.
Okay.
I don't see.
Okay, we'll pass that
Come
along.
on.
Here we go.
I mean, you know,
We can
it's,
stop right at that point.
that's economic development, that's
Yeah.
transportation, that's
Wow.
conservation,
Okay.
I mean, I just was thinking about that. I forgot another announcement, there was a PACE meeting, I want to say Friday at 8:45 at, Friday, 7:45 at the Gibson Aiken Center. And it's trying to get the town, persuade them to go with the PACE financing, or the next steps. I'm not sure where they're at with that, but I do think it's a good option if anyone's interested in it. Just throw that out there.
Paul?
That was last Friday. It was the
You're-
Citizens Breakfast that's
Okay.
at the
You're a
Gibson
little off
Aiken.
the pace.
We'll have to pay, oh. That's right, it was at the Citizens Breakfast. I remember the email now.
Damn Blackberry.
I bet it was good.
So do you have a report for us by any chance?
I didn't go, but I can
Okay.
talk about pace.
Kathleen?
Well, does anyone want to talk about PACE? I think that might be at some point, maybe not tonight, but
Yeah, not tonight.
okay.
Yep.
We got all these people here to hear from, too.
I'm finished.
Thanks. Liz?
Thank you. First of all, there was an article in the Reformer about Vermont ranking #1 in electrical energy efficiency programs. I think that's what you were.
Yes, that's what I was referring to this morning. I mean, that I heard this morning, yeah.
Yeah, but the transportation brings its overall ranking down to 5th place.
Wow. There you go.
We might want to put that in this section.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
What do we rank #1 in?
Electrical efficiency?
Electrical energy efficiency
Wow, in
But-
the whole country.
in the whole country.
Wow.
Yes.
What does that mean, though? Like, our
We are okay about being in the dark
per household?
per capita.
Don't know, you can read this.
Yeah.
It was a little vague,
We're
but
#1.
that's a Reformer for you.
Yeah.
Whoa,
On the introduction to the energy chapter, I like particularly the second paragraph with the bullets. I think it gives a nice logical organization, and maybe the introduction could be expanded to give maybe that narrative that Carolina thought might have been lacking.
Right, that's a good point.
Following those bullet points, I think, might be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
On page 5, where we talk about energy conservation, it might be nice to add a section kind of similar to what Timberly brought up, that talks about private energy weatherization firms are also available to Brattleboro commercial and residential users.
Right.
And that they create jobs.
Right.
so forth. Again, I have firsthand experience.
Or at least
Yeah.
one.
Yes.
Okay.
Also, I wondered about the transportation element of the pie chart on page 6. How much of this transportation is, journey to work that we discussed?
Right.
And how much is tourism? Didn't we have a meeting that said that you couldn't separate out
Yeah.
the tourism?
Yeah.
And
Right.
those drivers into Vermont are a major part of our economy.
Yep.
And,
They're supposed to be statistic for us.
well,
You
I
can't-
don't know.
you
I
can't-
don't think you can,
You can't get at it from here. I mean,
Other than counting Connecticut license plates, I don't know how you do that, but
we did exclude 91 from this measurement.
You did.
So for the somewhat weak justification that the majority of tourists are passing through,
well, we hope that they stay.
or at least stop
Shop.
briefly.
Shop and so forth.
Right.
But you might want to just mention that in the
Yep.
discussion,
I
because
think so.
that does,
Right.
it is important.
I should point out that I've been trying to work on this in a slightly different way, and at a much greater sort of, it's not more abstract, but it's at a national or even international level. So it turns out that there's, setting aside the issue of the Great Recession, that the vehicle miles traveled in the United States is peaking, and so also apparently is the size of the vehicle fleet in the United States. And so consistent to some extent with the peak oil scenario, there's a sort of a vehicle plateau, for want of a better term. So things are flattening out, and it turns out that taken in combination with some regulatory requirements that improve the efficiency of the U.S. fleet, both the truck fleet and the smaller vehicle fleet overall, that there's a leveling off of fossil fuel use in transportation. And so it's difficult to sort of like tease all the issues out, but part of that would be that in metropolitan areas, for instance, that there's a much greater uptake of use of mass transit, and there's the use of natural gas and other sources of energy for some of that, which reduce emissions, but are still fossil fuels to some extent. So there's a strong and consistent shift that's happening nationally. I don't think we're necessarily seeing it expressed locally to any great extent, but those changes are worth understanding and observing. So
you're going to put a,
I think in the transportation section that it's useful to include some of that information, and I think that because I would agree with Paul. We've talked about this at length frequently. I think a lot of our concern is associated with the use of fossil fuels and CO2, CO carbon emissions, and so the single biggest element in carbon emissions is transportation. There are some changes that can be observed
Agriculture.
already about that. So to that last point, a lot of the vehicle use that we observe in Vermont is what might be described as discretionary tourism. It's not and every household does discretionary travel on a daily and weekly basis. And so, and many households and individuals come to Vermont with things like snowmobiles or dirt bikes or ATVs being towed behind their vehicle, and their whole purpose for their recreation is to actually use more fossil fuels, so which is discretionary also. So I think we should expect to observe a change in that kind of behaviour as that becomes more expensive and more difficult to do. There will be potentially some negative effects associated with that from an economic development standpoint, as tourism at first maybe shrinks and then changes in its form. So it's not all good news, I guess, but I think that in the overall sense of things, from the standpoint of CO2 emissions, the overall reduction is something that's really important that we should be pursuing.
Also, on page 3, we're talking about energy sources. I would imagine we'd want to mention something about the controversy with Vermont Yankee, that it may or may not be licensed.
Yeah, there's it's a little non-topic of,
If we're kind of silent, so.
yeah, okay.
And then just when we get around to the energy and land use, in addition to, smart growth and compact development, that compact development also plays a part in the flood control measures that we were talking about, and energy efficiency, so they kind of go together.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't want to encourage a blanket encouragement of other types of efficient energy resources without having something that looks at the impacts associated with them.
Right.
The glare and the
Right.
shading and the noise and so forth. That's all I have to.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So let's have you folks have an opportunity to ask questions, make comments.
Could I make
Sarah?
one quick comment?
Any, if you're gonna comment, and you're
No, it's
welcome
not about
to.
that, it was about a previous
I mean,
conversation.
if
Oh,
you could stand
okay.
and just say who you are and where you're
Sure.
from, and that would be great. Thanks.
Sarah Edwards, District 3. One of the things I wanted to let the panel know regarding Michael Bosworth's comments and questions is about considering exempting energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements from the base for real estate appraisals. I better put these on. Real estate appraisals. We have been actually trying to do that for a number of years. I serve on natural resources and energy in the legislature, and that is a bill that we've put in for the last 2 or 3 sessions, and its time has just not come yet. But we feel very strongly that that's good because even with the PACE program, homeowners are making terrific capital investments, and then on top of that, having their appraisal rise is a burden. And if it's the state's goal to try to incent in any way we can renewable energy, especially since we have a goal of 90% by 2050 for renewable energy, we feel on the committee very strongly about that. Many members on the committee feel strongly about that, but we have not been able to convince the House in general of its benefits. So the other thing I wanted to let you know is that one of the things I've read a lot of the comprehensive energy plan that's out. Maybe many of you have commented on it, but in one of the appendices is a review of statutes that hinder or compete with each other to get us toward our renewable energy goals. So it may be something that people want to look into. I have not done my due diligence on that yet, but I expect it would be helpful.
Yep.
So
It
that
is
was
helpful.
Sarah, so in that property tax relief or exemption,
Mhm.
would that be municipal and school, or?
Since we didn't pass it, I quickly forget a lot of the details of that. So I tend to focus on the things that have a chance. And but it wouldn't be hard for me to look that up for you. Be happy to do
I'm
that.
just curious. Sometimes one side gets left out and the other one gets left in. And,
You're absolutely right.
yeah, okay.
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, thanks. Jason?
I'm Jason Cooper. I'm on the Energy Committee, and I wanted to speak about part that I've been working on, which is with regard to bike paths, alternative transportation choices. I was part of a group that was able to facilitate the acquisition of the old West River Railroad, which goes from the marina up to the quarry in West Dummerston. And that we're now in the process of making accessible as a trail. There's been a lot of excitement about that. And it speaks to many of the issues that you're talking about. It gives people the opportunity to recreate in a way that is not necessarily consuming fuels. People can come up to Vermont, and you'll notice that more and more of the cars that come up tend to have bikes and kayaks on the back, probably for the very reason that fuels are so expensive. But we've also, as we've started to do this, have found that people have been cheering us on and saying they're looking forward to that trail being accessible to commute into town. So that is another option that keeps vehicles out of town. And
Yeah, good.
one of the other parts that we're looking at is the possibility of connecting the end of that at the West River down along the Connecticut River right into the center of Brattleboro. There is the opportunity for that, and we're currently exploring that with the railroad. I guess it's the Boston, Maine, or Vermont Central, or whatever, that owns that. And I was surprised to find that in this version of the energy plan, and maybe it should be under transportation or several other places, but I would strongly encourage you to put in anything you can that will advocate for the support of the creation of any trails like this. It seems, excuse me, that it speaks to almost every one of the issues you folks have been talking about. I read in the notes that somebody spoke at the last meeting about opening up and accessing the riverfront, and the idea of having a mile of trail down that ties into our new green transportation center, the railway station down there. This would be an incredible asset. They would bring people in and encourage them to get out of their vehicles and enjoy the resources we have. So again, I just would encourage you to specifically state that you would support that and encourage it, because it's important to the community. Thank you.
Jason, what was
Thanks.
just a question, I remember there was an idea of a connector from, along the railroad tracks, on the Connecticut, over to the marina, to connect those two trails, and I don't remember how that was there a conception about how that might be done at some point, or?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. There is.
How do you get from the
there is-
Connecticut to the West River, I guess?
There is space, basically from the Riverview Restaurant, right along the water's edge, or not necessarily right at the edge, but between the track and the shore of the river, that would come up, travel up, and as it got to the mouth of the West River, it would be able to go underneath the railroads. One of the railroad's big concerns is anytime you cross a railroad, you've incurred a lot of concern and cost, and there's already an old dirt road that passes under it. It'd be very simple. And then just there is the issue that you'd need to cross Putney Road, but that's one road you need to cross. Right now, people who choose to come down from the north end of town, they're riding down Putney Road. And the idea of getting people off of Putney Road itself would be just a brilliant concept. But offering them the opportunity to enjoy sauntering along the river as just part of the vista and the commute into town would be great. Another thing that I would strongly encourage is the idea of some sort of bike racks or accommodations for people who do come into town. I often ride my bike into work. I use my bike from work to commute around to do the errands I need to do, and I often end up putting my bike up against a tree or a mailbox or a parking meter. I was up in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and all of the parking meters throughout the city have these little rings around them that are designed for you to be able to lock your bike to, and have a little picture on a bike on it to encourage people to let them know that that's what it's there for. And something as simple as that would make it so people had an unobtrusive place to put their bike, and again, it encourages the use of bikes and makes it a more welcoming community for people who are on them.
Okay, great,
You're welcome.
thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a few suggestions, and these are for policies 2 and 3 on the first page. The Energy Committee has been involved with some specific programs to increase energy efficiency in homes and commercial buildings, and I wonder if we could mention that more specifically. And the wording that I had, the suggested wording, was organized participation in programs to increase energy efficiency in buildings or in homes and renewable buildings. commercial buildings. And under Action 2.3, continue to support initiatives for improving the energy efficiency of municipal and school district buildings and operations. One of the projects we're currently involved in is doing an inventory of streetlights to see which ones could be turned off or reduced in wattage or converted to LEDs. There's now a tariff through CVPS for replacing streetlights with LEDs. And actually, Steve Barrett is involved. We're working with Steve Barrett to do an inventory and figure out which ones can be replaced. So one suggestion would be to mention that, to say, such as converting streetlights to LEDs.
Okay.
And then the final suggestion under that second policy would be to analyze existing zoning bylaws for barriers to efficiency and conservation efforts, such as what Rod mentioned with when buildings are blocked so that their solar potential can't be, so the sun is blocked from potential panels being put up, that kind of issue. And then under policy 3, just one suggestion. We're also working, the Energy Committee is working with some local companies, solar installers, to encourage the installation of solar electric projects around town. And these potentially would be available to sell power back to the town. So my suggestion is to have an action encourage town to purchase electricity from renewable sources. Thanks.
So is that, how's that work?
The way that would work is we would identify a site. A company would come in, an installer would come in and put up a solar electric array, and then they would sign a power purchase agreement with the town, so the town would buy electricity from that array for the same price or less than what they're already paying for electricity. And then there might be an option, say in 5 or 10 years, for the town to buy the array from the company and then own it, so that the power would then be essentially free.
So is that what Co-op Power and the co-op are doing? That's
Yeah.
the same deal?
That's
Yeah.
basically the same idea, yes.
Okay.
So I'm interested in this, Paul. So
Yeah.
basically you're buying the power before it hits the grid. Is that the idea? Or, because once it goes
No.
onto the grid, doesn't it sort of like, it's a bit like milk, it just sort of gets homogenized, it's just electricity?
Right. The electrons go into the grid, but through the net metering legislation that recently passed, the town would receive a credit,
Oh, okay.
basically, for that
Yeah,
power.
okay. I see what you're saying. So from an accounting standpoint, it's a little bit different. Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yep,
Okay.
you got all this. It's good. Thanks.
Thanks.
Sue, have you been writing all this stuff down?
Yeah, I'm going to see Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to see Paul tomorrow.
So I didn't get his, I got everything else.
Good thing.
Okay,
It's like, yeah, really.
thanks.
Or I can listen to the tape, which I hope you turned off, or watch.
Yep.
Okay. All right, thanks, Paul. Chris or Kathleen?
Kathleen White on the Energy Committee. Losing my voice. We've probably talked about this before, but on page 4 or 5, that chart of the energy use in town facilities, Green Street shows a huge decrease, Green Street School, in their energy use between the 2 years that were compared. And why is that? And maybe we should look at that, if it's something that can be replicated in other schools.
I can speak to that.
Okay.
I've just updated that table to include the data from 2010. And overall, if you look at all the buildings as a whole, the energy use decreased by 25%, or actually 26%. And in some buildings, it was a lot more than that. And I think that can be attributed in a large part to the Honeywell project that was done, and some other improvements that were made, replacing inefficient furnaces, for example, in several buildings. But we've made some real progress in the last decade in town and school buildings.
Did the Green Street furnace get replaced?
I'm not sure about that.
I almost think it didn't yet, like it still needs to be or something, but,
Yeah, that could be.
yeah.
The Oak Grove furnace was replaced as part of the Honeywell project, but
Yeah.
I don't think the Green Street has been. But some of the other buildings, like the Public Works Garage and the Municipal Center, had new furnaces put in that were much more efficient.
Oh, great.
Along that
That's
same line, I mean, I didn't look carefully before, but Canal Street School has a,
great. Nighttime program.
They have the evening.
it's the nighttime programs that,
I think they have a,
They actually went way up because in 2000 they weren't being used,
Right,
and now that they are.
oh, okay.
right, so it's sort of a little bit
Use.
deceptive because they're now being used.
Yeah, increase in use, okay, thanks.
Okay,
But they did weatherize their windows.
all right. Chris?
Thanks very much. My name's Chris Chapman. I live here in Brattleboro, have lived here a long time. And I have quite a few notes I've taken on the draft energy chapter. And I wish, before I say anything else, I wish to compliment the people who've put this together. It's a hugely complex issue, and you've been able to reduce an awful lot of variables and facts and trends to just a few pages. And my hat's off to the team that managed to do that. I had a number of suggestions and comments, if I could. I'd like to suggest that on page 2, under the introduction, that there be another paragraph that acknowledges the fact that this town plan document is being drafted as the town surfs a wave of change, a big wave of change. Let me just start with statutory items. As we've mentioned tonight, Complete Streets has passed. PACE was passed just barely this year, and it's around the corner for Brattleboro. In the world of the utilities serving our town, we've got the merger of CVPS and GMP, and then the subsequent merger with a Canadian company. We have net metering that has been passed as something that people can do, and that's only recently. Was that 2 years ago?
It's just been expanded.
It's just been expanded. Oh, thank you for clarifying that. We're going to have smart metering soon, which is really, speaking as a ratepayer, I think that's very exciting. An opportunity for savings. Vermont Yankee is litigating its relicensing, and it looks pretty clear to the average reader of the Brattleboro Reformer that whichever way the decision goes that's in the federal district court now is going to be litigated up through to the federal appellate level and perhaps even to the Supreme Court. Down at ground level, we've got CFLs replacing incandescent bulbs really soon. Electric vehicles have debuted and really come into vogue since the last town plan. We've got both hybrids and some all-electric vehicles, four-wheeled and two-wheeled. The use of vegetable oil, used vegetable oil, being recycled into a fuel substantive enough to power an automobile is here. We've seen weatherization grow to become a local growth industry. People are buying wood stoves, a few at a time. Yeah.
Not enough. Just kidding.
And bicycling is much more popular than it has been in the past 85 years or so. And I think it's really worthwhile to point that out, to put a lot of things into perspective, that what we want to achieve is largely underway. And part of what Brattleboro is going to do is to ride that wave and ride the inertia that's been generated here, and there's an opportunity to do so in a more creative way. And there's plenty of creativity in Brattleboro to do that. I think that's really beyond debate. That's really looking at this issue in a very positive way. A suggestion with regard to goals. I see nothing about solar hot water. Paul organized something I went to a couple of years ago on solar power efficiency, having to do with really solely solar hot water. And what I learned there was that solar hot water is a much more efficient process than, and cheap, more simple than solar electrical generation. And I think that a goal could be added there about solar hot water because it is so much cheaper and more efficient, and could be really a much, have, for the dollars involved, more of an impact on that the investment could make on reducing the use of fossil fuels for things like hot water. I'd like to see a goal of promoting carpooling. We've talked about it tonight, and Mr. Cooper talked about bike paths. I'd like to also include there promoting carpooling and enabling pedestrian activity farther out of town. There are no sidewalks south of Exit 3. There is no sidewalk north of the West River Bridge on Putney Road. There is a bike lane, of course, and that bike lane is actually turning out to be such a secure avenue of transportation that I have seen pedestrians using the bike lanes in foul weather. It was astonishing to see people walking on the bike lanes because it was safer than walking on the side of the road and more comfortable. And cars have been respecting those. Those are, I think the bike lane introduction has been a big success both on Putney Road and on Western Avenue. I'd like to see a goal being to ride that wave a little harder and do more with it. Another suggestion I would like to make is that this document incorporates some terms of art that are absent right now. One is energy security, because that's really something that we all want, and it's a motivating factor for a lot of the items that I've articulated here. The energy security is part of what we could call the town's overall resiliency. You could call it sustainability too. Resiliency is a word that, for me, resonates more because and I think because of the past things that we've been through this year, and I want to have something to say about that with regard to housing. You know, we've seen a town that is resilient by way of its community values. We have a town that has done a tremendous amount in support of its own citizens who've been in need when faced with the consequences of fire and flood of biblical proportion, you know. Another concept that actually is brand new to me that I've just learned about in the last week is a term that I think is going to become more prevalent here. It's out of Britain. I read it in the Financial Times, and the term is fuel poverty.
Yep.
We've not mentioned anything like that, but the fact of the matter is Vermont does have just that. We have a heat fund, and we have controversy about the heat fund. We have controversy about federal assistance for heat. And there is a prediction in the Financial Times, an article in the Financial Times that predicted that by 2015, did you see that, Rod, by any chance?
Yeah, I did.
That 10% of Britain, oh, here it is. Average household faces fuel poverty by 2015. Uncomfortably close. And it's our brethren across the sea. And the definition of fuel poverty is one in which a household's expense, in Britain at least, for fuel, for heating oil, no, gas and electricity, is more than 10% of household income. There was a follow-up story, which I thought was kind of amusing, grim, but amusing nonetheless, and that was in Friday's paper, Friday's Financial Times, and the headline was, "Soaring Prices Push the Queen of England Close to Fuel Poverty." And the lead was, you know, I've stopped reading fiction because you can't make this stuff up. The Queen, yeah. The Queen is coming perilously close to joining millions of her subjects in fuel poverty as energy bills for 4 palaces and a drafty castle absorb a rising share of her income. You saw that too?
No, I didn't see
Oh.
it, but I'm just laughing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we supposed to feel sorry for
Yeah.
her?
Well, she does get an allowance. She's living on an allowance.
She's on a fixed income, I think. is
She
what
could
she-
She's
sell
on
some of
fixed
her
income,
properties.
yeah.
That's right.
And how old is
We all
she?
don't
She?
have
Her
4
80s?
palaces.
Citizen discount.
Yeah,
maybe.
85.
Yeah.
85.
She gets the 20%
Okay,
cost.
so nobody's exempt. You could be the Queen of England and still be facing this problem. Or you could be a citizen of Brattleboro and facing this problem. Here's another article from the Reformer, one of my authoritative sources. And that is, the headline was, "Oil prices rise near $87 a barrel as recession fears ease." So even though we're paying $3.50 for regular gas now, we can be pretty sure that these prices are going to go up once we start out of this recession. This downturn can't last forever. There's a business cycle. You know that this cost is going to go up. A lot of people are going to be left behind. They have been left behind. So I think that the term fuel poverty is an appropriate addition to the lexicon of this document. What else? I wanted to suggest also that further in, on pages 4 and 5, that we add to the list of facilities Brattleboro Union High School. Part of our $55 million worth of construction included better insulation and a wood chip furnace, which has saved tremendous amounts of money. And I think it would be really worthwhile, if possible, to measure the change in energy consumption. I remember when the school board was considering whether to actually move ahead with a renovation, that one of the big statistics that was dropped on the conversation was that the high school was burning a barge load of fuel oil every winter. And energy conservation was a big part of the construction project. The wood chip facility has been a big innovation. It's been quiet. Nobody's really heard much about it. It's been uncontroversial. It's been a wheel that doesn't squeak. And I think it's worth mentioning, and proudly, because it's an achievement. Let's see.
Why isn't the high school there?
I beg your pardon?
I'm just wondering, the high school isn't a town facility?
Although
The Union District.
it's part of the Union District, but we pay a
Right.
lot of taxes
We should-
toward it, and it is in Brattleboro on Fairground Road.
We should call it out.
Yeah.
We should call it out.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, great. Easy and I think entirely appropriate. And also, I would make a note under that, and I would just suggest this, that what's forthcoming is more efficient wastewater treatment,
Right.
Good point.
including cogeneration that utilizes the methane produced in the digesters. That's a big deal, too, because it really shows that we're doing a lot of the right things as we surf this wave of change in energy. What else? And other than that, I just have some other suggestions. I'd be happy to sit down with someone if they'd like, just to go over this. But once again, I'd like to really compliment the authors of this. I think it's a big team, and thank you for the effort you've gone in, because this is so key, in my opinion, to the success of the community and the municipality separately, but, of course, related quite closely. And so once again, just thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And
Thanks, Chris.
I think you can probably hand those things even.
If you want to drop it off, yeah, we can make a copy and then give it back to you, or, yeah, that's fine.
Full chicken scratches.
That's all right.
Okay.
We can do that.
Chickens are part of our energy plan.
Oh, that's right. Oh, that's the net thing.
They're not called out here,
Yeah.
but, I'm sure they'll find their way in, so.
So I wanted to ask Chris if he is indirectly giving lots and lots of credit to the House Natural Energy and Resources Committee for a lot of this legislation and the stuff that you've named. Is that right? Just say yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody, for your comments. And why don't we, just one last time, anybody has anything else to add from the commission, or any questions or anything?
I have one question. A couple weeks ago, a couple meetings ago, we were talking about land use and having a debate about the floodplains. And this is a question: is there an opportunity to? We don't have to talk about this tonight for the sake of getting things done, but I think it would be worth talking about if there's already a disturbed area. Would that be an opportunity to do some kind of solar array? Just rather than put it on individuals on their roofs, it's more efficient if you combine it. So, would there be an opportunity to call out one of those places, or any one of them, whether it's in West
Right.
Brattleboro?
Right.
It would be a good opportunity to.
There was something that I wanted to mention a little bit earlier when Paul was talking about this, and probably shows that what's going on in our office. One of the odder features for being able to feed electricity from a solar array onto the grid is that you need access to phase 3 wiring at the sort of street level. And so one of the things that we've got that's not included in the chapter yet is actually a map of where you can access phase 3 wire. So one of the interesting things, for instance, and I'm speaking because of my commute patterns and so forth, obvious locations for solar arrays include farms because of the amount of open space, and particularly for dairy farms because they're also large consumers of electricity for refrigeration and for the pumps, for the milking process. Typically, most dairy farms now in this part of the state are well located with reference to phase 3 wiring. So the farm on Route 5 in Dummerston, Sweetwater Farm, one of the reasons why it had such a big solar array now at one of its fields right up against Route 5 is that it can access the phase 3 wire that goes along Route 5. What this also means, though, is that more remote locations and more domestic settings have a challenge in terms of being able to feed large amounts of electricity onto the grid because they don't necessarily have access to 3-phase wire. So that's a level of technical kind of infrastructure that we're interested in exploring. So we want to include that map in this chapter. And then the last part about that is I agree, depending on the location, and already, I think your term was already disturbed, so an already developed part of town that could have a solar array located at it that feeds onto the grid.
West Brattleboro is just something that came to mind.
Right. It makes, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think that's the obvious kind of, rather than developing a greenfield site almost entirely for the purpose of putting a solar around. We haven't actually encountered somebody attempting to sort of cut down trees to put up solar panels, which, you know, would be a little odd. But I think for the most part, people view already developed land as beneficial because of the ease with which you can do it, right? It's just from an installation standpoint, it's easier. And one of the actions under Policy 3 is to conduct a solar panel suitability inventory of public and commercial buildings, rooftops, and/or parking lots. We could expand that, I guess, a little to include other sites, but I think that in general we feel like there are literally acres of rooftops and parking lots that could be developed with solar panels.
Brad, so that inventory, who would be the person to do that, or the office to do that, or who would do that, do you think?
Us and
Yeah.
the Energy Committee, and we'd probably just make Jeff Nugent do it.
Is that, I
He doesn't
mean,
know that yet, so don't say it.
yeah, but in terms of being able to
Yeah, I mean,
cite things, he
there's some,
could do
there's
that
some
in his.
funky mapping things that you can basically just turn upside down to do it. It's
Yeah.
sort of actually oddly easy.
Uh-huh, okay. Great.
Something you just said tripped off something for me, and what's the possibility of, I mean, I could see in the future neighborhoods wanting to create their own, yeah, like their own little utility, or a number of people, somebody putting in a solar, you know, like I could have solar on my house that would feed the other 3 houses in my little neighborhood. Is that, I mean,
That's exactly what net metering is about.
Yep.
Is that you can have a solar array in one location and use that, as you say, on an accounting basis, what it generates to offset any collection of meters, no matter where they are. They don't have to be in the same group. They can
Right.
be anywhere in town. I think they can be anywhere in the CDPS
Network. Yeah.
generation
Right,
area.
right.
So would that count for something like, if a developer comes in and wants to put 50 houses on a plot of land, but he's required to give, I don't know, let's just say 50 acres to conservation? West Brattleboro, something going on out there like that. Would solar or wind be considered to not count towards that?
You could design it so that it was an offset, so that if
If you weren't cutting down trees,
right,
I guess.
if you weren't cutting down trees. So I mean, I think that there's some devil in the details issues. I think the other thing that's important to point out here with wind generation is that given current technology and the physical landscape of Vermont, it turns out that Vermont is not necessarily a very effective region for wind-powered electricity generation. So aside from the Searsburg site and some other, you know, for at commercial levels. So certainly anything in the Whetstone Brook Valley floor is really not very useful for wind at all. There's no vortex effect. There's nothing that you can identify.
I guess I was speaking more towards solar.
Yeah.
And I think about Keene, the Home Depot area, that, you know, that giant expanse of lot of land and all the land around it that hasn't been touched, per se. It seems like that would be an opportune place to, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
That's an example
Right.
of
And
somebody
I
having
think-
to suffice a bunch of random.
right, and I think once you go to places like California and stuff, for instance, and you go to airports and you realize that all the parking for the rental car companies is sort of undercover, and then what the cover is a series of solar panels. So the cars are shaded from the sun by solar panels collecting electricity. You know, at some point when the economics change, thanks to the Chinese, that solar panels will become useful enough as sort of an awning that you'll see people looking at parking lots and supermarkets and so forth as a potential site for generation. I don't know what point that's going to break out like that, but you know, we've got lots of open air parking lots and we've got lots of capacity to install
Sure do.
solar panels to do it, so,
Yep.
you know, I think that's the model that we're thinking about as we go forward.
Okay,
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, one more thing.
yep.
Are all of the issues that were discussed in that sustainability meeting been absorbed into this draft of the energy plan?
Which sustainability meeting?
The big one,
One
with all the
at
committees
the
and
Grad
Yeah.
Center.
Yeah, yes. The information that we captured in that,
Mhm.
that has informed this chapter, yes.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Good, good point.
Okay, well, I think it's great.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah, this is good.
So let's move on to the housing chapter now. That the idea here is to do a sort of a quick run through, because it's pretty early. Was that a good way to say it, Sue?
Yes.
Pretty early. This is an
Something.
early draft, not just a draft. It's a draft.
It's a very drafty draft.
And it's got more statistics and current conditions in it than anything. And the idea was to look at the current conditions and just see. I happen to have some questions here that I could ask and people can respond to, and just to sort of guide this discussion a little bit. So why don't we just jump in to that?
Can I just point out a couple of things?
Sure,
Because
yeah.
it is really all over the place, but basically what we're seeing is that Brattleboro is not experiencing a growth in new housing units. It's just been pretty flat for, about 60 years. Which
A brief period of time.
pretty, that goes along with the population as well. Households, and it's not here, but they are getting smaller. I mean, their average is 2.1 or 2.3 household size. And
But that points out, though, I think that more dwelling units have been developed than it would seem if the population has stayed the same, because the household size average has gone down, and it's a fairly big drop, so where for instance, all the houses up and down Western Avenue have been converted from big families, in a lot of cases, to now they're commercial and apartments. And I'm just saying that the average size of the household is what, 1.3 people or something in Brattleboro, or 1.4?
I think we're just over 2,
Oh, just over 2? Okay.
2 and a bit. Yeah.
So, I mean, the household size has gone down quite a bit
Right.
in that time that you mentioned. But the population of town has stayed the same, basically, right? And so there are more dwelling units, even though they're smaller. Must there not be?
Mathematically, that's true, ish.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
there's developments out and about, but bigger
Right.
houses have been turned into apartments, collections of apartments in some cases, more accessory apartments than there used to be, and so forth. So it's development, but of a different sort, not like tracts of houses or anything like that.
I need to think about that a little bit, because the housing units is based on units, not structures.
Right,
Right?
right. The
Right.
dwelling, the
So it's
dwelling
actually
unit
not
number
playing
is
out that
not,
way.
is not a structure number, it accounts for multiple dwelling units in a single structure, or a
Yeah,
combination.
that's what I'm saying, is
A
that
combination of
there
uses.
must be more housing units if the population size has stayed the same and the average household
Yes.
numbers have gone down. And they've gone down by 50%, or, I mean,
I'm not sure, I mean, part of my hesitancy here is actually really trying to remember exactly how much household size has gone down.
okay.
So I
Well,
think that the
anyway.
other possibility, I mean, I think the other thing that's apparent on some level is that there are a large number of single-person households in homes that have got more than 1 or 2 bedrooms, and many, you know, empty nesters and other categories that we use to describe people who are occupying larger homes than they otherwise might. So I guess what I'm also trying to get at there is that I think that there's a series of sort of sub-market mismatches that are apparent in Brattleboro as well. So compared to other bigger metropolitan real estate markets, for instance, the ability for somebody to move from a comfortable family home where they've raised their children to a smaller apartment and have amenities that they're expecting is somewhat more limited here perhaps than you might otherwise realize as well. So, in other words, people are trapped in larger houses that are more difficult to heat and maintain than they otherwise would be, because there is a shortage of appropriate housing for their needs. And wants, you know, market wants is, I think, a part of it. So,
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to
Yeah,
jump in.
we'll bear that out
Yeah.
in the next,
Yeah.
yeah.
next go-round. We've talked about this before, but we have 51% of our households own their home, while 49% rent, and that's really different than the state and national trends, which is more closer to like 90% own and 10%
Yeah.
rent. But
67, I think, is home ownership nationally.
statewide, it's.
Statewide, it's 90, yeah.
But it's important to consider Brattleboro in its context. I mean, this is a rural county, and we are the major job center and service center, so, you know.
And that relates to the income disparity of the town as well, that owner-renter ratio.
Mhm.
So-
Yes, yeah. There are other important parallels in terms of poverty experience and household incomes and so forth. So when you take, if you take, for instance, the towns that contribute to the Union High School district, as if you want to take that as sort of a surrogate market area for housing, so that if you wanted to have your children attend the high school, you could choose any one of 5 or 6 towns. Straight away at that point you start to go back towards at least the national average in terms of the balance between home ownership and rental. So maybe it's better to think of Brattleboro as the equivalent to the neighborhood around major retail, work, and transportation nodes in a larger metropolitan area, surrounded by more conventional kind of suburban areas of development where there are extremely high levels of home ownership.
When we were talking about the amount of people that are single occupancy vehicles, there are a lot of people who don't live in Brattleboro because they say the taxes are too high. They're living in Dummerston, they're living in Williamsville, Newfane. It's a significant difference from what I understand. So with the energy, what were they talking about? Anticipate there might be more, no, that's not it. Something along the lines of consider exempting energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements from the base real estate appraisals. I mean, that, if you did that, wouldn't that keep your taxes lower and encourage people to live here if you wanted to do something like that? Seems like another reason to justify.
Sarah Edwards says they're trying to get that
Right.
statewide.
At the statewide, yeah.
I haven't seen any modeling data on what kind of effect that would have on tax income. My immediate response is that municipalities would suffer because it's tax revenue that they would forego.
Yeah, but wouldn't people be more likely to live here or even build a house if the taxes were lower?
I don't know.
But they wouldn't be lower, they'd go up.
That's a
So,
tough
Sue,
sell for the
Yeah.
select board.
Were there some more points that
Yes.
you wanted to
Right.
make about
Or say, no, I think, right?
this write-up? to start with?
Well, I guess a couple other points, and I need to work through this with the listers a little bit. So when I talked about housing, age, condition, and value, that was based on listers data because we don't have some of the more recent census data I'm trying to work through. But basically, our homes are old, the housing units are old. We have an old housing stock here, so, and that bears out in kind of condition where, and I'm probably gonna switch this, after talking to one of the listers, to a different, way, but it's still gonna bear out the same way, that there's probably, the quality of our housing stock is not that great. It's not awful, but it's, it's hovering in the middle.
Mostly because it's older.
Mostly because it's older. Yeah.
Right. Data that the listers collect includes data on depreciation and also what they call the effective age, which are not quite the same things. And so you could have a totally renovated late 1700s or early 1800s home that has an effective age of 2010 because the whole thing has been effectively disassembled and reassembled to a high standard. Or you could have a 1950s house that has an effective age of whenever it was built because apart from very basic maintenance, it hasn't been upgraded. Or, some very minimal maintenance has been conducted on it. Or more realistically, we're somewhere in the middle where many people own homes from the 1800s or the early 1900s that have had substantial improvements to the roof and the mechanical systems and so forth, and so has an effective age of 1970 or something, which is still, compared to large parts of the country and the rest of, at least lower New England, old.
But the point of this data, I'm assuming too, is to discuss what the future demand would be, so that we could channel the future section of the report
Mhm.
to say
That's
where we
right,
want to
what-
encourage and where we want to discourage.
Right.
Right.
Like if there's so many more renters, then that affects the type of housing that you'd want to encourage.
Right.
And then if there's not much growth at all townwide, then that would give us backup to discuss the fact that, the flood regulations and everything else, we want to curb development in the western half of the town.
Mhm. Okay. I guess the only other more developed part of this is that we do know that there's a shortage of housing for seniors with special needs, so assisted living or some sort of residential care. That's based on state studies that have been done and predictions. We've also have an organization with a community development block grant right now through the town that's investigating that need as well. So the state's aging.
Who is that, Sue?
That is Hilltop House.
Oh, uh-huh. So they're investigating the possibility of,
Changing the level of service that they offer.
uh-huh,
So they're, I think, residential care now, and it doesn't make sense to do something different.
uh-huh.
So we obviously, I haven't worked through the housing affordability, but I guess what I see as the two biggest housing needs that is coming out of it is going to be a need for affordable housing, as well as improving the housing stock. So I think that's kind of the direction that the chapter will go, based on what I've seen.
Okay. So maybe the most pertinent immediately question here is well, I thought it was a question here. Maybe it's not. So I guess, I mean, I was thinking we were going to speak a little bit about the housing situation post-flood. I mean, we've absorbed not absorbed. We've had the fire
Right.
and flood, and we've lost a certain number of housing units, I don't know, 60, 70 between the two, maybe?
More.
Yet to be
Well, the
determined
fire
with the new
was-
formula.
Yet to be determined,
The
yeah,
old formula.
yeah. So, but I guess, you know, we didn't have any cushion before, really, to speak of, or not much cushion.
No, we didn't have a cushion before.
And now we have negative cushion. And,
Cushion as in available units?
yeah.
Yeah, in bigger markets, you talk about vacancy rates, and you can measure vacancy rates, and there's what they call a sort of a friction level of vacancy, a little bit like employment. So if you have unemployment, or if you have a vacancy rate of 2 or 3%, it's just on any one day, people are moving from one housing location to another, and so you've got 2 or 3% of the stock vacant. Brattleboro, first of all, we don't have really good data on that, but anecdotally, I think there is very little actually vacant housing stock in town. Before the Brookside fire, that was the case, and it's exacerbated now because of that and the flood. So we basically don't have any available housing stock, and that forces many people into difficult settings, doubling up, living with family and friends, using motels as medium-term accommodation, and over-dependence for some people on overnight shelters because they can't find safe and affordable housing that's suitable to their needs.
The development in West Brattleboro across from the Chelsea Royal Diner, when was that built?
Westgate or the subdivision?
The one,
Sure.
the one that's
Are
for,
they the
Complex.
blue apartments? Are they blue?
the ones that are at the very end. they're just
Westbrook.
Westbrook. I'm not
Westbrook.
sure the age of Westbrook. I would suspect from looking at them 80s, but I can't say for sure.
Might be a little earlier than that.
Yeah.
It seems like,
I think they were the 70s.
yeah, I would think 70s, yeah.
That's cool.
Because I don't remember them going up. I got here in 77, so.
I would, yeah, I would just take a stab at early 80s
But
from
probably in the,
from the appearance of them, but,
yeah, yeah.
okay.
So, I guess, for instance, where are the alternatives to building housing in vulnerable areas? I guess that's one
Yeah.
big question, right, in town.
Well, yeah. Sue and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I think before Irene, we were already concerned about steep slopes and other kinds of physical features that made further development of certain parts of town either technically complex and difficult to permit and with attendant extra costs. And then I think since Irene, we're much more sensitive to that hazard factor. And if I feel a little bit out on a limb and saying that West Brattleboro has been the site for most of the more recent single-family dwelling type accommodation, but I think that that's probably true.
Yeah, Edward Heights and
Yeah.
what do you call that one?
Circle,
Up,
right,
Over
on the hill.
West- Westgate.
right. Oh, that's not really
Well,
West Brattleboro.
Not that.
Carriage Hill.
Sherwood Hollow and
Carriage-
Carriage
Sherwood
Hill.
Hollow,
Hill.
right.
And
Carriage
so
Hill.
all three,
Right. Mm-hmm.
those three places along that kind of
Right,
slope.
probably some of the most recent.
Yeah,
So I think we're concerned that we should incorporate hazard mapping or risk, some sort of risk assessment into areas that we think are suitable for continued residential development. And we're also concerned that both to the south and the, assuming that Route 9 runs east-west, which it doesn't always, but, so the stuff to the south around Ames Hill and the stuff to the north around Sunset Lake Road, we're concerned about how much more development either of those areas should accommodate on the basis of the risk profile for mostly accessing Route 9. It seems to us the individual location might be okay, but or the individual house site might be okay, but access to Route 9 might be challenging. And so the more people that you put in that circumstance, the more difficult it's going to be. And
So
then,
that's like a cumulative impact type of thing?
yes, exactly. Trying to measure the cumulative impact of continued subdivision at the level of 3 acres per site or something like that. So we could model that to some extent. I think the short answer to your question is, aside from redeveloping more intensively certain existing neighbourhoods, which would require some pretty big shifts in the behaviour of the market, Putney Road is the obvious open land area where we would think that you could reconsider that. That gets us back to this other question, though, about how best to actually undertake that or how best to do that. And we think that, again, there's a market failure problem there because meeting some of the challenges with that land as it's presented, because it's commercial land now, and what would be required to convert it to suitable residential neighbourhoods is a very large upfront capital investment, and it's better suited to a single developer or a consortium of developers rather than the more traditional speculative house, small subdivision undertaken by somebody with access to machinery and limited surveying capacities, and then hoping that over time parcels will be bought individually and homes built on them, because we think that's a model that isn't very dependable in terms of the outcome and won't resolve the housing demands that we've got, and won't provide the variety of housing stock that we clearly need. But I guess our big challenge is trying to figure out how to actually create an appropriate market to deliver these things.
How about something like a planned unit development
Yep.
with certain incentives built into it to achieve the type of housing stock?
It remains a mystery and somewhat of an irony to me that in the whole state of Vermont, I don't think there's one PUD ordinance that incorporates bonuses for PUDs. In almost everywhere else in the country and internationally, PUDs work because there are incentives to do it. And as far as I'm aware, there are no incentives to do PUDs in Vermont, which is a very peculiar thing.
Is there anything that precludes it?
No, except I think except for market expectations and behaviour.
Well, we could be trailblazers.
Yes,
That's right.
yeah, I'd love that.
One of the things that we've also been thinking about right now our PUD regulations, you can do them in certain zoning districts, but it then becomes a zone change.
Yeah.
And it's also a lengthy process. So if you look at the connection between housing and land use, well, one of the things that you're often looking at is how can we improve our regulations or the process to make it easier. I think that most people would say it can be a little cumbersome with our PUD regulations because it's a zoning change, so it's all these steps. So a lot of towns deal with it as an overlay district and actually designate the areas that you can do a PUD, not necessarily tied to the underlying zoning
Right. So
district.
some of those early questions that you want to have established around a PUD, such as access to mass transit or schools or store, all those kinds of location-specific questions about whether this is an appropriate area for more intensive development, have already been resolved because the Planning Commission has gone through and mapped out where they think PUDs would work and be suitable. And we think that is a preferable model, and it would give far more clarity to a potential developer because they would simply know from looking at the map where this was conceivable. The next step is trying to figure out a way of providing incentives. I think that, in fact, the ability to access relatively, and I say relatively cheap greenfield land for residential development really undercuts the effectiveness of offering incentives for PUDs because it's a hard thing to compete against.
But where is that? where in Brattleboro is there relatively inexpensive greenfield land development?
I think there's potential, I think there's potential for it along Route 9, to be honest. It's not, it may not have been pursued so far, but, I
So
would,
that's the other side
yeah.
of the coin then. If you
Making
have
that more
the
expensive
flood
and more
control,
difficult.
Making
Right.
that difficult, and then you make it
Right.
easier in the PUD overlay,
Right.
then you achieve the balance that you want.
right, and I'd say in Vermont, that's in general what the issue is. That, and I have an architect, well, he's the chair of the Putney Planning Commission, often refers to the kind of 5 to 10 acre house on a 5 or 10 acre parcel as northern New England sprawl. And he's not wrong about that. It's a pretty common occurrence. And I would say that's a really big percentage of the residential home ownership market in this town and surrounding towns. And I think actually if you start trying to understand the housing market for Brattleboro and surrounding towns, that's a lot of the reason why people actually are choosing alternate towns, knowing that their children and their jobs and their shopping and other activities are going to be undertaken in Brattleboro. I think it's a large part of Vernon. I think it explains a large amount of the development in Guilford and other surrounding towns. And you can see that market segmentation going on, and that's what you're competing against. When a developer looks at how many housing units they could sell for an intensive development off of Putney Road, they're attempting to attract people who've got the resources to spend $350,000 on a house in Vernon on 4 acres, and that might coincide better with people's expectations of how they want to live here. So, to put it in a different context, if you're in Burlington maybe, or other parts of the state that's more intensively developed, people might be more open to condo-style living or more compact townhouse type development and pay similar amounts of money for that as you would for, say, 5 acres and a 3-bedroom home.
I guess I always think about Morningside and the fact that, that's there. And, the thing you hear people say a lot is if we had another Morningside, that's easy to say. And I know it took a while for that to get built out and it took a while for it to get sold, but I don't think those units sit
No.
empty for
No, they don't.
long at all. They sell and,
Right.
now I don't know if that's the right, if
Right.
that size condo project or, those size units or whatever, or that type of setting, I don't know,
Right.
Maybe there's not that, but it almost seems like out on Putney Road, there are a few places where that sort of thing could happen. And whether there's the market or not is
Right.
a question,
Right.
Right.
And, I think one other thing that should go into this chapter is the post, housing bubble stuff, that, the question of whether it's better to rent or own, and whether we haven't, as a nation, pushed ownership further than it should have been pushed. I don't know, that's a whole, that is a big question. I mean, you listen to the radio, and people are talking about that, and it's it's an open question. That's the American dream,
It's an open question.
obviously.
Is it a question that the town is going to resolve, though? I think you could look at our
Oh, no,
numbers and
no,
say,
I'm
wow,
just
we're
saying that-
almost
but if
50-50,
in-
so we're actually pretty good in that regard.
All right.
Well, I'm just saying that the 50-50 mix that we basically had for a long time in town, some people I know point to that and say, Brattleboro's way too rental
Oriented.
oriented.
Right.
But I'm just saying that nationally,
Right.
people are questioning, the ownership orientation.
Right.
And wondering if as a nation, we wouldn't be a little better off if more people rented rather than be stuck with home ownership.
Right.
In some cases.
There's no necessary relationship between quality of life and even personal wealth and home ownership, because, for instance, Turkey has one of the highest levels of home ownership in the world, and doesn't necessarily do well by other measures. So that part is clear. I guess my question for you as a group would be, to what extent do you want us to incorporate that kind of discussion into this chapter? Or we've been throwing this around in the office for a while. We're concerned about housing from a couple of different standpoints. Before the storm, we were interested in how to approach the housing topic in conjunction with the land use chapter and some other chapters, with the idea of kind of neighborhood, sort of the quality of neighborhoods and the experience of life, the quality of life in various neighborhoods in town, and how, and it's a pretty vexed question, and it's a pretty difficult one to actually encounter, but we feel as if that there are potentially at least streets, if not parts of streets, in various areas of town where there might be some discouragement to home ownership and improvement of homes, because it's unclear as to which direction the neighborhood is headed. And so we've tried to get at that with data in a couple of different ways, and the best we can do is the condition of housing as sort of an analog for that. And what we're really interested in there, in that topic, is trying to address the question of the sort of neighborhood level quality of life, acknowledging that Brattleboro has a high percentage of renters and so forth, but that trying to explore what avenues we had for improving the level of the block, block by block in certain parts of the town, what the community experience would be. And then we're conscious that there's a mismatch between stock type and household type that's pretty serious and difficult to negotiate. But that if we had more variety of stock, including a lot more new housing stock, that then you get more movement within Brattleboro. Mm-hmm. People moving out of one kind of housing, making it available for a younger family, for instance, and moving into an apartment because it suited their stage of life better. We think basically that, I guess that's the term for it, there's a mismatch between life stage and housing stock that's pretty profound here. And then the last part that's more informed by the Irene experience is we think that the development that's probably taken place for the most part between 1950 and now is, for whatever, in the residential area, for the better or for worse, has occurred along the Route 9 corridor, and we've got questions about whether that's sustainable from a hazards point of view now. So, I mean, they're kind of the layers that we're working with, and I guess our concern is that, a little bit like transportation and energy, a lot of it's market driven. A lot of it is to do with bigger trends or issues that the town has real difficulty kind of directly engaging with. It's just things that we can shift around a little bit, and so trying to find the appropriate level of discussion and then coming up with meaningful actions and policies has been a real challenge for the housing section of the town plan. And we're conscious that any kind of real strong push to, for instance, improve the quality of housing would probably increase the cost of housing and the value of housing, which would then have a detrimental impact on many households that are currently here, and we're conscious of those things too. So,
if there's neighborhoods that you're aware of that you were saying were kind of on the bubble, are there public improvements that could be recommended? Not necessarily housing improvements, although
Right.
there might be a funding for improvements.
We've thought about that.
But, like, there was an article in the Sunday Times about public improvements that improved upon some impacted neighborhoods,
Right.
like improved stairways and so forth. So maybe that's
Right.
an idea.
Yeah, and we thought about that to some extent with the sort of the adoption of the complete streets model and trying to sort of rank or prioritize neighborhoods from that standpoint. We think, for instance, that the area from, Canal, from exit 1 north to the edge of downtown on both sides of Canal Street to some extent is a real meaningful, by new urbanist standards, a real meaningful, compact neighborhood with walkable compact neighborhood with work-live opportunities sort of built in. There's access to schools, which are both a source of, employment as well as education. There's many retail opportunities. There's downtown. It's all within reason, relatively walkable. And we feel like if we could direct some resources there or focus our attention on that section of town without excluding, the priorities that are present in other parts of town, that would be something that could be beneficial.
So that's what we're talking about with the AARP
Yeah.
grant, right?
Yep, and it's part of the reason why
That's
we're
the
trying
place and-
to, come back to that location constantly and also take advantage of the sort of the big institutions such as the school and the hospital that kind of anchor that neighborhood.
So that could be
When they get,
a kind of a goal or an action that we could say that we will pursue those sorts of opportunities to focus on a neighborhood or focus on a
Right.
stretch where, maybe a high leverage point.
Right.
Sort of thing.
Right. And we're sensitive to the idea that we don't want to exclude other areas of town, by prioritizing this neighborhood more highly, but so
But
we're,
we've been talking though about prioritizing in sidewalks and so forth. I mean, that's
Right.
that's the sort of thing that it is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
yeah,
So it's getting close to 8:30, and why don't we talk about this, for about 5 more minutes, I think is what we have on our television program. The commercial will come on in 5 minutes. So just to say that's where we'll draw the line. And we have one member of the public left here with us.
Thank you. Is that my cue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go.
Thank you very much. I was just looking at the weather, and I rode a motorbike tonight, and there's a storm just about to come upon us, so I was
Okay.
getting a little antsy, but
And it's electric
just
too.
going to say,
So,
yeah, right.
yeah.
Do you have snow tires on it, though?
I don't even have rain tires, okay. Yeah, I had some thoughts on this draft, and what I would like to do is make some suggestions similar in format to what I made for the energy chapter. And one is that I would suggest that in the introduction that you include a statement that addresses the context in which this is being written, the historical context. It's being written at a time of significant displacement because of the Brooks House fire, the flooding along the Whetstone Brook, and the Hayes Court renovation project, which is just about to start. And it's being written during a wave, I guess it's maybe the tail end of a wave of improvements that have come over Brattleboro. When I was a boy, there were parts of town that most of the town was ashamed to talk about and didn't want to drive through, and that has changed tremendously, thanks, I think, in large part to the work of the Wyndham Housing Trust, as we know it now. They've done beautiful work on some very, very troubled housing. They've really taken some distressed properties and made them quite nice. And I think that really should be put into the context here. Yes, we've heard a lot this evening about how old our housing stock is. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of it's really being well cared for. There's a lot of money that's been put into, I'd call reinvestment in properties. You don't have the slums and slumlords prevailing in some neighborhoods where you did before, but really well-managed, well-rehabilitated communities even here in Brattleboro, and I think that's really worth mentioning. And it's taking this being drafted during a major economic recession that was largely kicked off by problems in the markets relating to mortgage financing. I think it's really significant that that's in the backdrop, and I'd like to suggest that that be included. Current conditions. Rod has made passing reference to the fact that we have an aging population, and that and what I've seen, and this is anecdotal, and perhaps Rod and Sue could flesh this out more with some statistic, is that our aging population is increasingly seeking to relocate from far-flung locations closer to services such as those provided downtown or near the hospital. I'd like to suggest under policies and actions that the town promote the utilization of the PACE program and the Rental Housing Improvement Fund. Rod, what's the name of that fund? I can't remember right now. I haven't had dinner yet, and I'm getting woozy.
Rental Housing Improvement Program.
Rental Housing Improvement Program.
Yeah, RHIP.
RHIP.
And apartments and homes. And apartments and homes.
That's true.
Apartments and homes, yes.
And, yes, there's another program.
Mm-hmm. We have, as you know, at the co-op, which is perhaps that construction project should also be mentioned in the introduction as part of the context or the current, or listed under the current conditions. We have that major program underway to construct a lot of single-room occupancy.
Yep.
Yeah. The Rental Housing Improvement Project or program can also promote good opportunities for single people in a society that's no longer dominated by the nuclear family. Very big opportunity. Some other opportunities, I call it a silver lining resulting from the fire and flooding, is that there's a chance to really redevelop part of Main Street that was all housing of a single type into mixed-use housing. Now, I know this is probably a sensitive subject. We don't talk about it. We don't see much in the newspaper about it because that's all in the hands of an individual, not a corporation. But it seems that this trend of people looking for services closer to the urban community rather than the rural community is an opportunity. Also, this is an opportunity to improve energy efficiencies and enable aging in place at the Hayes Court complex. And I think that's exactly what they have in mind, but it is indeed an opportunity there. The SASH program was something that the Housing Authority leadership brought to the Select Board a few months ago. A wonderful, wonderful aging in place type of initiative, a model really for our town. Another is I think that a policy and action should be to promote weatherization and other energy efficiency. I mean, we just had a long conversation about that. It makes sense to incorporate that right in here. It's housing after all. And finally, I think that another opportunity here is to revisit the fluvial erosion policy, which will influence not only commercial development, but housing development as well. I know it's very late in the game, in the year, but I would like to challenge the Planning Commission to take another look at that and bring it forth.
Okay, have you got a gauntlet you can throw down there?
No, I left it on my bike. I had some gloves, but
That's true.
but to
appropriate,
challenge,
isn't
it just seems the time is right to do the right thing. We don't run for office here To make friends, we run to do the right thing. And often we're very, very weary of what we've been through. I might just draw an analogy to the Battle of Waterloo. It was nearly won by Napoleon. If it hadn't been for the chance turnaround of a unit of German, of Hessians, that Wellington couldn't have taken advantage of the opportunity to make a charge that turned the tide of what was a losing battle. And I think that the Planning Commission here has a huge opportunity to follow on what we all recognize is a gaping vacuum in policy on development in flood-prone areas. And for the sake of avoiding future suffering on the part of very vulnerable individuals, because I think we all know that it was the most vulnerable individuals in our community who were most affected by that flooding. I believe that we as a town, beginning with the initiative of the Planning Commission, should bring this policy up again for a vote at the very earliest opportunity. Let me say that it's not just to challenge you people, but for the sake of our most vulnerable citizens. I think we have an obligation to try to do the right thing in that regard. I'm tired and I'm hungry, but I'm willing to work on this as hard as you are, and I'll support your efforts in this.
Okay, thanks for that. Chris?
Thanks. Yeah, really. Thank you, Chris.
Sure. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think I might be able to get home dry if I leave right now.
Go fast.
So, that's, I think, going to,
I'm happy to grab anybody else's immediate kinds of off-the-cuff
Okay.
response, if you want.
It's got a lot of work to be done.
In the next 2 minutes, I mean, just anything you want to throw out, just to guide us in our work. But
got any immediate thoughts?
I have a question about, right now, how does it stand when somebody's house doesn't exist because of the flood? It gets wiped out? Or are we, West Brattleboro, good example, what's the rule? Can they rebuild? Can they
it
put another?
depends, is the answer.
Yeah. That's a
It
complicated
depends on
question.
where, and it depends on, in the first instance, it depends on where the structure is located, where the home is located, and the extent of the damage. And the answer becomes more involved than that immediately after you've got those two answers. So the rules that we operate by are that if the structure is in the floodway, and we have several that are in the floodway, if they're habitation units, which is a home, then you cannot issue a permit for a new habitation unit in the floodway. We have pre-existing grandfathered-in homes where the damage that has been sustained or the improvements that are pursued by the owner exceed 50% of the assessed value. Then they have to they would be rejected for their permit, because it would once the value of the improvements or the damage repair exceeds 50% of the assessed value, they have to come into compliance, and the only way to come into compliance is to leave the floodway. So that's that
That
category.
threshold is, it's the threshold set by the National Flood Insurance Program.
Yeah.
And it's for any
Federal.
Right, and it's any 3-year period.
Isn't that where one of the big rubs with that issue is right now, though, is it's 50% of what value specifically? You just said of the appraised or assessed value, but appraised is a relative term. Appraised by who? Appraised by?
There are different modes of valuation that are
Right.
that can be utilized.
And also, I read something somewhere today where somebody was quoting that it was, in someplace, they were suggesting that it was of replacement value and not of appraised value. Because really, I only one particular situation came to my personal attention just because I knew someone who was involved in it, and it was you know, it seemed like it was funny, it was one of those sort of situations where many people who are now facing that dilemma were probably quite content for many years, thinking that their $50,000 barn was only appraised at $5,000 until now, when it's gonna cost $25,000 to put beams on it or something like that, and now that's maybe half of what it's worth, but yet 5 times what you previously had it appraised at. And that's where now it seems like that conundrum of, wow, I was pretty content when the taxes were low and the appraisal was low, but now, well, that's not really what it's worth. You know, it seems like it's a difficult spot for a lot of people to try and balance those two competing interests, where, you know,
Yes.
you're put in that quandary by
Yeah,
that.
it is.
But wasn't there a reappraisal of the town
2010.
just last year?
Right.
Yes.
But still, if you look at a lot of those figures, if you just look down the grand list with any sort of familiarity with some of the properties, a lot of those numbers really aren't, there's not, if you look at some of the land tracts alone, there's inconsistencies in some of those things. And I mean, one in particular I know of is a barn that was appraised at $4,500, and the repair estimate was $50,000 or something like that. And I think it got reappraised at, for the sake of this issue, at $9,000 or $10,000 or something, but still it wasn't. You know, it didn't meet the criteria, and so it was.
So,
That's got to be a tough one for secured parties,
it is a
not
tough
to
one.
say the least.
Yeah.
The homeowners.
Are we ready
Yeah.
to adjourn?
I think so.
I move, we adjourn. I think we're
Is
done.
there a second?
A second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.